Hey guys, welcome back to Matthew chapter 21. I'm so excited for this one. I read through it once before the video, and there's just some really cool parts of the Bible in this chapter. So yeah, I'm just gonna read through it once and then just share some thoughts and some stuff that really stood out for me. So yeah, here we go. When they had approached Jerusalem and had come to Bethphage at the Mount of Olives, Jesus then sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village opposite you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied there and a colt with it." Excuse me. "Untie them and bring them to me. And if anyone says anything to you, you shall say, 'The Lord needs them,' and he will send them on immediately." Now this took place so that what was spoken through the prophet would be fulfilled. "Say to the daughter of Zion, Behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did just as Jesus had instructed them, and brought the donkey and the colt, and laid their cloaks on them, and he sat on the cloaks. Most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others were cutting branches from the trees and spreading them on the road. Now the crowds going ahead of him and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest." When he had entered Jerusalem, all the city was stirred, saying, "Who is this?" And the crowds were saying, "This is Jesus the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." And Jesus entered the temple area and drove out all those who were selling and buying on the temple grounds. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he said to them, "It is written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer,' but you are making it a den of robbers." And those who were blind and those who limped came to him in the temple area, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he had done, and the children who were shouting in the temple area, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they became indignant, and they said to him, "Do you hear what these children are saying?" And Jesus said to them, "Yes, have you never read, from the mouths of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise for yourself?" And he left them and went out of the city to Bethany, and spent the night there. Now in the early morning, when he was returning to the city, he became hungry. And seeing a lone fig tree by the road, he came to it and found nothing on it except leaves alone. And he said to it, "No longer shall there ever be any fruit from you." And at once the fig tree withered. Seeing this, the disciples were amazed and asked, "How did the fig tree wither all at once?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "Truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what was done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and cast into the sea,' it will happen. And whatever you ask in prayer, believing, you will receive it all." When he entered the temple area, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him while he was teaching, and said, "By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority?" But Jesus responded and said to them, "I will also ask you one question, which if you tell me, I will also tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John was from what source? From heaven or from men?" And they began considering the implications among themselves, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say to us, 'Then why did you not believe him?' But if we say from men, we fear the people, for they all regard John as a prophet." And answering Jesus, they said, "We do not know." He also said to them, "Neither am I telling you by what authority I do these things. But what do you think? A man had 2 sons, and he came to the first and said, 'Son, go work today in the vineyard.' But he replied, 'I do not want to.' Yet afterward he regretted it and went. And the man came to his second son and said the same thing. And he replied, 'I will, sir.' And yet he did not go. Which of the 2 did the will of his father?" They said, "The first." Jesus said to them, "Truly I say to you that the tax collectors and prostitutes will get into the kingdom of God before you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and prostitutes did believe him. And you, seeing this, did not even have second thoughts afterwards so as to believe him." Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard and put a fence around it, and dug a winepress in it, and built a tower. And he leased it to vine growers and went on a journey. And when the harvest time approached, he sent his slaves to the vine growers to receive his fruit. And the vine growers took his slaves and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again he sent other slaves, more than the first, and they did the same things to them. But afterward he sent his son to them, saying, They will respect my son. But when the vinegrowers saw the son, they said among themselves, This is the heir. Come, let's kill him and take possession of his inheritance. And they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those vinegrowers? They said to him, He will bring those wretches to a wretched end and lease the vineyard to other vinegrowers, who will pay him the fruit in the proper seasons. Jesus said to them, Did you never read in the scriptures, a stone which the builders rejected, this has become the chief cornerstone. This came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing its fruit. And the one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and on whomever it falls, it will crush him. When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they understood that he was speaking about them. And although they sought to arrest him, they feared the crowds, since they considered him to be a prophet. Wow. So good. Wow. Such a good chapter, right? Chapter 21. There's so much in this chapter. It's actually a pretty long chapter. But the first thing that stood out for me was, let me take a sip of my tea. This is rooibos tea, which is from South Africa. I'm a South African guy, so I love rooibos tea. But anyway, the first thing that stood out for me was that, well, just the fact that Jesus came in on a donkey, right? And I think I've mentioned a few times during these, the past videos during Matthew, about how the expectation of who Jesus was so different than who he came and lived out to be, right? Like, people was expecting the Messiah to come and be this Davidic warrior king who will lead Israel to victory from the rule of foreign nations. And if the Messiah was that, I don't think he would have come on a donkey entering Jerusalem, right? He would have come on a horse with, like, portraying his military power, with his people around him maybe on horses with weapons and stuff like that. But here comes the Messiah who is there to deliver Israel, but just to deliver them from more than what they expected to be delivered from. Not just the foreign nations, but actually from sin and death. And he comes on a donkey, humble mounted on a donkey he comes, not flexing his power. And Jesus was really powerful, right? But he chose not to operate in that way. Though he was in the form of God, he did not choose to use his equality with God as something to his own advantage, right? I think I just misquoted that a little bit, but it's Philippians 2. Though he was in the form of God, he did not see that as something to be grasped or to use to his own advantage. He made himself nothing. The fact that Jesus comes in on a donkey, and everything that happens after that, how he's beaten, how he's treated by people, it's all his choice, right? He chose to lay his life down. No one took his life from him. He chose to give it away. He could have, at any moment, he could have had deliverance. Could have done this, and like more than enough angels would have showed up and delivered him, but he chose to give his life. Yeah, he's just amazing, right? So yeah, I think that was really cool, how just again the donkey portrays how Jesus, the Messiah, he's so misunderstood, and he's definitely not coming in the way that people expected him to come. And that, I think that plays into the second thing that stood out for me, and this is like really interesting. And I've been reading some books about, right? I read a book and I've been listening to some stuff about N.T. Wright. Not about him, some stuff that he's written, and he's very big on the New Testament. And I think reading his stuff has really given me a lot of insight on just what actually happened when Jesus came, and what is the gospel, and what does it mean that Jesus came in. He was saying how, you know, when God left the temple in Ezekiel, right? So the glory was in the temple, but then when Israel was exiled, Ezekiel had the vision of God outside the temple. So God left the temple and he never returned, right? Like, even though Nehemiah and all the people came back and they rebuilt and they kind of reestablished their nation, God did not return to the temple. And I think there's the verse, I'm unsure if it's in Nehemiah or in Ezra, but actually maybe it's not in either of those. I think it is though, where the people were weeping at I think the inauguration of the new temple, because it was nothing compared to how it was. And the main thing, I think, is the presence of God was not there, right? Whether they were weeping because of that, I don't know. Maybe it was just how it looked, but that was the main thing. God never returned to the temple until Jesus came. And in Matthew 21, God does return to the temple. But again, it looks so much different than what people expected it to look like. And he does not come as a cloud and as fire, but he comes as a man, and he throws their tables over, and he rebukes them for making his house not a house of prayer, but a den of robbers. And that's just such a powerful idea to me about how, everyone wanted God to return to the temple. They were expecting God to one day, I think, right? So this is kind of my understanding. I might be wrong, but this is Bible study. So I'm giving what I think, and you can write in the comments what you think, right? So I'm just gonna be open, but I think Israel was having this expectation of God's return to the temple, and how God would restore all things and how God would restore Israel, right? So they were expecting God to, in a way, return to the temple and make things beautiful again. But he does come just so differently than what they were expecting. And this is like the story of the gospel. God comes to his people, but they reject him. They reject him. He comes to his own people, but they reject him. And Jesus comes into the temple, returning to the temple, right? God returns to the temple, but it's just it just looks so much different than what people were expecting. And again, they reject him, right? It says that when the chief priests and scribes saw the wonderful things that he had done, and the children who were shouting everything, they became indignant. And this is just a story of Jesus, right? He comes and he is just himself, and people doesn't want him for him. People don't want God for God. They're satisfied with the praises of men and their traditions, but they don't really want God. And yeah, I think the third thing is the last thing that stood out for me. I'm really happy that I'm still making the video, because I was expecting there's a bunch of guys staying with me right now, and I was expecting maybe they're gonna arrive at home and it's gonna be loud, and I would probably have to stop the video or something like that. But yeah, anyway, so last thing that stood out was when he entered the temple area, the chief priests and elders asked him by what authority is he doing this. And this is a really interesting one for me, because the authority that he had came from God, right? God gave him authority. God appointed Jesus, right? He was appointed by God to be doing what he was doing. He is God. He was appointed by God. He was appointed by the Father, all the stuff. But people, they didn't really recognize his authority. They were questioning his authority. And this also happened with Paul, right? I think it's in 2 Corinthians, 1 or 2 Corinthians, but where Paul is I think it's in 1 Corinthians actually, but the people of Corinth are challenging Paul's authority because, and this might be Corinthians or Galatians, but it's where Paul starts the letter, and he says that he has been appointed by God with what he is doing, right? And what people were doing was people came to, I think, the people in Corinth, and they basically said, Paul isn't really the main guy. Paul actually received his gospel from people who are higher up than him. So, and those people are saying stuff that's different than what Paul is saying. So if you really want the truth, you should actually listen to them, because Paul just received this gospel from other people. I think this might actually be Galatians. I'm not going to look it up right now, but I think it might actually be Galatians, where Paul defends the fact that he received this gospel from God, and God called him to be an apostle and appointed him to be an apostle and gave him the message of the gospel to preach. And he is answering he is answering to God, right? Like, he is doing what he's doing because God appointed him. But the point was, I'm saying I think a lot, but I'm not gonna claim to be confident about something that I'm not 100% confident about. But as far as I know, it was the fact that people were just challenging Paul's doctrines and basically saying and lying also about what the people who are above Paul is saying about the gospel, which would have been like probably the people in Jerusalem, right? So, and that might have been like maybe they were saying that Gentiles need to be circumcised to become part of the family of Abraham, which is obviously a lie, because it's just not true. But so people were questioning Paul's authority that God appointed him to live out and live as an apostle. Same thing with Jesus. His authority is challenged by people, and I think it happens. It still happens. Like, God tells people to do things, and people don't want to acknowledge the fact that maybe God spoke to that person. And it's like interesting, because it's great to live in community, because obviously some people might be saying that they're doing stuff because God appointed them, and they might be not, but then other people are doing it that way. So how to navigate, I'm not sure. I think the key is to not live for the praises of men, because what happened with the Pharisees, because in this part where they're speaking about the authority of Jesus and questioning his authority, they didn't want to say what they really believed because they feared the people, right? Literally says, but if we say from men, we fear the people. And they were not willing to live in the truth and to what they believed, because whether that was right or wrong what they believed, because they were living in the fear of man. And if you really are trying to obey God, you might really get to a point where you have to reject fear of man and do things, even though people might scold you or reject you because of it. But you'll be willing to do it if you're not living for the praises of men, right? But the praise that comes from God. And I think if you're also not living for the praises of men, and you're trying to usurp authority that doesn't necessarily belong to you. Is usurp the right word? What's usurp meaning? Take illegally or by force. That's a perfect English word. Let's go. I'm not even English first language. If you're trying to usurp authority or keep your authority by force, and someone is claiming to do what they believe God has asked them to do, you might reject them because you're going to be afraid that you lose your position. But if you're just living for the praises of God, you'll actually be surrendering your position that God has maybe appointed to you. You're not going to try to defend it out of fear of losing it, like David lived like that. He and Saul did not. Sorry, that was so much information, but I hope it kind of made sense. Anyway, this is Bible study, right? So it's fine. I think that's everything that I wanted to share, but thank you guys for watching. Bless you. And I hope you are all blessed, and whoever watches this, I hope you are doing absolutely great. Peace.